Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to be talking about the absolutely fabulous Mary Wollstonecraft, often thought of as the mother of feminism. I'm going to be analysing and close reading her early novella, as we would call it, published in 1788. And I'm going to draw on her feminist tract, a very important text in the history of feminism, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which was published in 1792. So 4 years after the text that I'm going to be primarily focusing on. But in Mary Fiction, many of the feminist seeds that we see later in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman are sown. So I think it's helpful to draw on the later text to help illuminate the earlier one. In particular, I'm going to be examining the preface to Mary Fiction, as Wollstonecraft calls it, the advertisement. I'm going to focus on genre. So how Wollstonecraft describes the genre that she uses and why it matters that she describes it in the way that she does, that she calls it Mary a fiction. I'm then going to move on to look at the figure of the heroine and how heroines were expected to be and how they were represented in the 18th century. So I want to see how Wollstonecraft sets her own heroine, Mary, against and in contrast to expected norms in the late 18th century. And I'm then going to close read the short preface. Throughout, I'm going to keep in mind how this relates to ideas of gender and what we might call proto-feminism. Proto because there are some aspects of Wollstonecraft's work that feminists nowadays, from the 1970s onwards, might see as somewhat problematic. I don't really have time to go into those today, but suffice it to say that we can generally call Wollstonecraft a proto-feminist. Remember, if you like my channel, do please subscribe. It means that you'll see my new weekly videos when they're uploaded, and let me know if you like the video by hitting the thumbs up. I'm going to start by reading through the whole of Mary Wollstonecraft's advertisement. In delineating the heroine of this fiction, the author attempts to develop a character different from those generally portrayed. This woman is neither a Clarissa, a Lady G, nor a Sophie. It would be vain to mention the various modifications of these models, as it would to remark how widely artists wander from nature when they copy the originals of great masters. They catch the gross parts, but the subtle spirit evaporates, and not having the just ties, affectation disgusts when grace was expected to charm. Those compositions only have power to delight and carry us willing captives where the soul of the author is exhibited and animates the hidden springs. Lost in a pleasing enthusiasm, they live in the scenes they represent and do not measure their steps in a beaten track, solicitous to gather expected flowers and bind them in a wreath according to the prescribed rules of art. These chosen few wish to speak for themselves and not to be an echo even of the sweetest sounds or the reflector of the most sublime beams. The paradise they ramble in must be of their own creating, or the prospect soon grows insipid and not varied by a vivifying principle, fades and dies. In an artless tale, without episodes, the mind of a woman who has thinking powers is displayed. The female organs have been thought too weak for this arduous employment, and experience seems to justify the assertion. Without arguing physically about possibilities, in a fiction such a being may be allowed to exist, whose grandeur is derived from the operations of its own faculties, not subjugated to opinion, but drawn by the individual from the original source. I'm going to start by considering genre. So genre is the kind or the type or the classification of a text. In this case, I'm going to be thinking about the classification, the genre of the text that Wollstonecraft writes and how she delineates which category she thinks it falls under. So as we can see from the title page, the text is titled Mary, a Fiction. And that subtitle, a fiction, was odd and unusual in the late 18th century. That wasn't a familiar title, so you won't have really encountered it elsewhere because it was not often used. Wollstonecraft is doing something odd and unusual. She doesn't, for example, call it a novel. We are perfectly happy today to refer to Mary as a novel. Neither does she call it a history, and these two terms, novel and history, would have been far more expected at the time of publication. So why doesn't Wollstonecraft use these classifications? I now want to think about the term novel, and I'm going to do this by looking at Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman. This is from chapter 4, subtitled Observations on the State of Degradation to which Woman is Reduced by Various Causes. And many novels in the 18th century were written as if they were for women only, although of course men did read them too. But this is what Wollstonecraft says. Novels, music, poetry and gallantry all tend to make women the creatures of sensation, and their character is thus formed during the time they are acquiring accomplishments, so basically their teenage years. The only improvement they are excited by their station in society to acquire. This overstretched sensibility naturally relaxes the other powers of the mind and prevents intellect from attaining that sovereignty which it ought to attain, to render a rational creature useful to others and content with its own station. For the exercise of the understanding as life advances is the only method pointed out by nature to calm the passions. Novels encourage sensation, and this overstretched sensibility acquired by sensation relaxes the powers of the mind, prevents intellect from attaining sovereignty. So the argument here is that intellect should rule over sensation and sensibility. It should be sovereign. So novels inhibit readers, primarily women, from being rational creatures. Novels do not exercise the understanding, but exercise the passions, and Wollstonecraft wants to write something which exercises the understanding. Essentially, the argument here is that novels promote the passions over reason. And this is an example of a self-proclaimed novel. This is Eliza Haywood's Love in Excess, or The Fatal Inquiry, a novel, published in 1719, and it was a very popular novel when it was published. So you can tell from the very title, as with Mary, a Fiction, the title here, Love in Excess, that it's going to be OTT. It's about excess passion and female desire. It is not about rational creatures, and it really, really doesn't pretend to be either. It's also interesting, I think, to note that the genre, the term novel, is the largest thing on the title page. What you're drawn to on the title page is the very fact that it's a novel. And because of texts like Eliza Haywood's Love in Excess and others before and throughout the 18th century, the term novel gathered these slightly scandalous connotations. To circumvent the scandalous connotations of the term or the genre novel, later 18th century texts often used the term history instead. And history implies a certain claim to reality and a certain claim to facts and events as they have actually happened. Apparently, at least. And here are two very, very popular examples by Samuel Richardson, who was the most popular writer of what we would now call novels in the middle of the 18th century. But as you can see, Richardson does not call them novels. He classifies them as histories. So we have Clarissa, or The History of a Young Lady, comprehending the most important concerns of private life, and particularly showing the distresses that may attend the misconduct of both parents and children in relation to marriage. And also The History of Sir Charles Grandison, in a series of letters published from the originals, by the editor of Pamela and Clarissa. So these two texts really present themselves as biographies of the central character, histories of the life of the central character. And history is used in these 18th century novels really for truth claims. So Clarissa talks about the history of a young lady concerning private life. So it's as though this is her real private life that is being narrativized, that is being presented to readers. Similarly, in Grandison, it says that it is published from a series of letters, published from the originals existing in real life, and then this text being a gathering of those real life letters, those apparently real life letters. On both, it doesn't say written by Samuel Richardson, it says by the editor of Pamela and Clarissa. So Richardson presents himself as an editor of real life letters rather than as the inventor of fiction. So returning again then to Wollstonecraft, I want to think about the significance of her categorizing her novella as a fiction. Why does it matter that Wollstonecraft classifies her text as fiction? Fiction nowadays is a very familiar literary term. We're all familiar with the category of fiction. Indeed, all prose writing really is divided into fiction or non-fiction, into that which is made up and that which is apparently not made up and apparently deals in facts. But Richardson, for example, in Charles Grandison, really presents the text as non-fiction. It claims to be fact-based. It claims to be factual. So the idea that we have, that we're very comfortable with, of fiction as a literary category had not yet been really fully established. And we can see that when we look, for example, at Samuel Johnson's dictionary from the mid-18th century, so from 1755. This is his definition of fiction. So the three definitions are the act of feigning or inventing, the thing feigned or invented, and the third definition, a falsehood, a lie. None of these three definitions define fiction as a literary genre. We can see that things are inching towards the acceptance of fiction within literature through the quotation provided by John Dryden. So John Dryden's quote says, "Fiction is the essence of poetry as well as of painting. There is a resemblance in one of human bodies, things and actions which are not real, and in the other of a true story by a fiction." In other words, we're moving towards the idea, although it's not yet defined as such, but we're moving towards the idea that literature can be both fictional and truthful. There is a peculiar conceit then in Wollstonecraft's title. Wollstonecraft's Mary, a fiction, self-consciously draws attention to itself, in Johnson's words, as a feint, an invention, a falsehood, a lie. Why does Wollstonecraft do that? Well, all will become clear at the end of the advertisement. And I think it's worth noting here that it's particularly ironic, because Mary Wollstonecraft titles this text Mary, that there are in fact many autobiographical elements within this text, and it's drawn from her actual real life experiences, despite the fact that she calls it a fiction. And that's unlike a heroine like Clarissa, who is an entirely idealized image of womanhood constructed in the mind of Samuel Richardson, which brings me on to the depiction of the heroine. How does Wollstonecraft set her own heroine apart from other typical 18th century heroines? Wollstonecraft draws attention to Mary as a heroine of fiction in the very opening of the text. So this is the opening line of chapter 1, Mary, the heroine of this fiction. So it's not just in the advertisement that the fictionality of the heroine, Mary, is explicitly drawn to the attention of readers. It's in the very opening line of the text itself, the main body of the text, and it's in the very opening line of the advertisement too. You cannot escape that Mary Wollstonecraft is drawing attention to the fictionality of her heroine. In delineating the heroine of this fiction, the author attempts to develop a character different from those generally portrayed. You'll notice also that Mary Wollstonecraft refers to herself as an author, unlike Richardson, who had referred to himself as an editor. This woman is neither a Clarissa, a Lady Grandison, so that's Harriet Byron, who's the heroine of Sir Charles Grandison, nor a Sophie, and that refers to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, so that's Wollstonecraft's own footnote there. So I'm now going to move on very quickly to look at what Wollstonecraft would later write about Rousseau's Sophie in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And incidentally, Wollstonecraft does talk too about Richardson's Clarissa in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, if you're interested in going and having a look at that for yourselves. But this is what she says about Rousseau. The character of Sophie comes from Rousseau's Émile, or On Education, which was first published in French in 1762, published very quickly thereafter in English, and went through many, many editions in the later half of the 18th century as a really, really popular text. And this is what Wollstonecraft says, and this is in chapter 5. Animadversions, so that means sort of criticisms, on some of the writers who have rendered women objects of pity bordering on contempt. I shall begin with Rousseau and give a sketch of the character of women in his own words, interspersing comments and reflections. Sophia, says Rousseau, should be as perfect a woman as Emilius is a man, and to render her so, it is necessary to examine the character which nature has given to the sex. One of Rousseau's central arguments is to do with the natural character of women. And if you want to create a perfect woman, then you have to draw on those natural characteristics. You have to push those natural characteristics to their most perfect extreme, and then you will have a perfect woman. He then proceeds to prove, there's a bit of sarcasm I think there in the word prove, he then begins to prove that women ought to be weak and passive because she has less bodily strength than man, and from hence infers that she was formed to please and to be subject to him, and that it is her duty to render herself agreeable to her master, this being the grand end of her existence. But Wollstonecraft's heroine is not a Sophie, explicitly not a Sophie. She is not weak and passive, she knows her own mind, and she is not formed to please men. Mary indeed is disgusted by her husband and does not try really to please her husband at all. So neither Mary, the heroine, and this is also important, neither does the narrative voice consider it to be Mary's duty to render herself agreeable to her master, or even indeed that her husband is her master. He's not really presented as her master either. And it's important that the narrative voice as well as the heroine are both on board with that position, because often in conservative novels of the late 18th century, early 19th century, you'd have a contrast between the heroine and the narrative voice. So the heroine might go against the status quo, but the narrative voice throughout the novel kind of chips away at the heroine and presents the heroine as being silly or a fool or unwise for going against the typical status quo. But in Mary a Fiction, the narrative voice and Mary the heroine are aligned in their outlook, and that's fundamental, crucial to understanding the text itself. Mary Wollstonecraft would later write in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman that I wish to see women neither heroines nor brutes, but reasonable creatures. So women should be neither heroines, that is, they shouldn't have a kind of false education or affectation, and neither should they be brutes. Neither should they have no education or be mere animals. And you'll remember that Émile subtitled On Education. It's a text about how Sophie ought to be educated in order to make her the perfect woman. But Wollstonecraft doesn't want a heroine or a brute, so a falsely educated woman or a non-educated woman. She wants reasonable creatures, women educated with reason. Wollstonecraft then intends to portray a new kind of heroine, one who is a reasonable creature. In delineating the heroine of this fiction, the author attempts to develop a character different from those generally portrayed. I'm now going to apply this to the whole of the rest of the preface of the advertisement. It would be vain to mention the various modifications of these models, as it would to remark how widely artists wander from nature when they copy the originals of great masters. Other writers, when writing women, copy the models of a Clarissa or a Sophie, so they wander from nature. Such heroines are in fact unnatural, despite the claims to truth. They catch the gross parts, but the subtle spirit evaporates. So the obvious parts, the gross parts of a woman, the outline of a woman is captured, but not the natural inner workings or the subtle spirit, as Wollstonecraft calls it. And not having the just ties, affectation disgusts when grace was expected to charm. So such heroines are not just representations of women, and because readers have no just ties, no connection with them, they disgust rather than charm. We're told that apparently these heroines ought to charm us, but they don't for Wollstonecraft. Instead, their affectation disgusts her. They are mere affectation rather than depicting a just or a true kind of grace. Those compositions only have power to delight, sensation, and carry us willing captives where the soul of the author is exhibited and animates the hidden springs, lost in a pleasing enthusiasm. Again, the idea of sensation, lost, that such readers lose themselves in their enthusiasms. They're misguided. They live in the scenes they represent and do not measure their steps in a beaten track, solicitous to gather expected flowers and bind them in a wreath according to the prescribed rules of art. So delight and pleasing enthusiasm, they're focusing on their sensations, so much so that they become willing captives. Such novels like Clarissa, keep women enslaved to sensation. They become lost in enthusiasm. Readers don't see how prescribed such novels are, and they don't see, in fact, how conditioning these novels are. They do not measure their steps in a beaten track, solicitous to gather expected flowers according to the prescribed rules of art. So they get carried away in their sensations, and what they don't see is that they're being conditioned to follow certain tracks, to follow the steps of the beaten path. That is what those compositions do. These compositions, however, Wollstonecraft separates off from those compositions. These chosen few wish to speak for themselves and not be an echo even of the sweetest sounds or the reflector of the most sublime beams. Wollstonecraft's women, heroines, want to speak for themselves. They don't follow the prescribed rules of art and the expectations of a heroine. They are not a mere echo repeating back what has already been said, and we'll note that in mythology, Echo falls in love with Narcissus. The paradise they ramble in must be of their own creating. And you can see from Wollstonecraft's footnote there that she's referring to Paradise Lost. So her footnote says, I here give the reviewers an opportunity of being very witty about the paradise of fools, etc. I think you can tell here Wollstonecraft's tone is rather sarcastic. So the Paradise of Fools refers to Paradise Lost, the epic poem by John Milton, first published in 1667 and was really very influential and hung over much of the 18th century. The Paradise of Fools is an area of boundlessness. So in the poem, Eden, the paradise of God, is depicted with a very definite and very strict boundary, that there is a Garden of Eden, it has a wall, it has an edge to it, and outside of that is chaos. So the Paradise of Fools, alternatively, presents a place where there are no boundaries. Wollstonecraft here, of course, also is drawing on Satan's speech from Book 1 of Paradise Lost. The paradise they ramble in must be of their own creating. And the wit that she imagines that reviewers are going to target her for is because Satan says famously, the mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. She's preemptively suggesting that reviewers are going to mock her and her position in saying that women must create their own paradise, saying that that position is satanic, saying that that position is ungodly. So for Wollstonecraft then, paradise for women must be of their own creating and not a mere echo of what others tell them should be paradise. Otherwise, they're just living an insipid half-life. And Wollstonecraft very much presents this as a matter of life and death. That's the imagery that she uses. A woman's paradise must live, otherwise it will die. And how does it live? By women heroines speaking for themselves. In an artless tale without episodes. So without episodes means without set pieces, without the familiar incidents that often happen in a novel. So in an artless tale, without those episodes, without those set pieces, the mind of a woman who has thinking powers is displayed. So Mary, a fiction, ironically, is an artless tale. So we've got the juxtaposition there of fiction and artless tale. Novels and histories such as Clarissa and Sophie are more artful. They follow the prescribed rules of art, i.e. they are full of artifice, of falsity, of lies, in Johnson's words, than Wollstonecraft's text is, despite Wollstonecraft's text being a self-described fiction. The female organs have been thought too weak for this arduous employment, and experience seems to justify the assertion. Wollstonecraft really is being sarcastic here. The arduous employment of thinking and the experience seems to justify the assertion because women, as experienced through typical 18th century novels, are willing captives of passion rather than engagers of their thinking powers. And now in this final sentence we get to the crux of why the text is called a fiction. So Wollstonecraft says, without arguing physically about possibilities, in a fiction such a being may be allowed to exist, whose grandeur is derived from the operations of its own faculties, not subjugated to opinion, but drawn by the individual from the original source. Not subjugated to opinion, that is, made subordinate to others, but instead is reliant on one's own self. Wollstonecraft here explains why the text is called a fiction, because she wants to escape the physicality. So in Rousseau's text, for example, she says in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman that a woman's weakness of body is evidence of their weaker thinking powers. And you'll notice that Wollstonecraft draws attention explicitly to the female organs, and that really highlights the physicality. Female organs have been thought too weak for this arduous employment. Not the female mind has been thought too weak for thinking, but the female organs, the female brain, the physical brain of women has been thought too weak for the arduous employment of thinking. So what she's doing then is she's bypassing essentially the argument of Rousseau. Rousseau said that women are physically weaker than men and therefore less capable, have less strength in the organ of their brain. What Wollstonecraft is doing then is, by saying this is a fiction, she's avoiding having to make an argument about physical possibilities. Without arguing physically about possibilities, in a fiction, such a being may be allowed to exist. So she's saying, okay, it's a fiction, it's made up, it's not true. So given all of that, I've already said that this really is an impossibility. By calling it a fiction, Wollstonecraft has already escaped potential criticisms of it being unrealistic. Because she's already positioned it as an invention, she's highlights explicitly, as you can see there, the word possibilities is italicized. So she's drawing attention to the word possibilities, and she's almost saying, okay, so I'm imagining this rational creature, this heroine, this Mary, who is the heroine of this fiction, and we don't have to argue about the possibilities of her being a rational creature because I've already told you that this is a fiction. I've already told you that this is a lie. So we can bypass having that whole argument. I'm going to avoid making that argument because in fiction, such a being may be allowed to exist. You might argue that she can't exist in the real world, but in this imaginary world, such a being is allowed to exist, and I'm going to depict the life of such a creature, such a rational creature. Thank you so much for listening. I really do love Wollstonecraft's text here. It's so rich in sarcasm and rich in really interesting, fascinating details. I do hope you found it illuminating and it's made you think a bit more about how Wollstonecraft positions her gender-related and feminist, or you might say proto-feminist, arguments in counterpoint to the dominant 18th century ideas about genre and about the figure of the heroine. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel, do please subscribe and like the video if you found it helpful. I'd also really love to know what you think. There's so much to say about Mary Wollstonecraft, the fascinating, wonderful, brilliant writer that is Mary Wollstonecraft. Thank you.